Never finished the show, folks, but hey, the light's on. I can see you. Hello out there. Hello. Nice to you. That's right.
At 88, Elvis's Tailor reveals the secret that left him in tears. His hands won't stop shaking. 88 years old, sitting in a small apartment in Memphis, and the man who once dressed the most famous entertainer in human history can barely hold the photograph he's clutching. It's a picture of Elvis Presley, mid-performance, wearing one of those iconic jumpsuits that defined an era. But this old man isn't looking at the rhinestones or the cape or the impossible confidence radiating from that stage. He's looking at the seams, the hidden places, the secrets only he knows are there. For 60 years, this Tailor kept his mouth shut. 60 years of interviews he declined, book deals he rejected, documentaries he refused to participate in. Everyone wanted to know what it was like to dress Elvis Presley. Everyone wanted the glamorous stories, the celebrity anecdotes, the behind-the-scenes magic of creating those legendary costumes, and for 6 decades, he gave them nothing. Not a single word. Until now. Within the first 90 seconds of agreeing to speak on camera, this man broke down completely. Not the gentle tears of nostalgia that you might expect from someone his age reflecting on glory days. These were the heaving, gasping sobs of a man releasing something that had been poisoning him from the inside for nearly half a century. And when he finally caught his breath, when he finally looked up with those watery eyes that had seen things the rest of us can only imagine, he said something that changed everything. He said he wasn't crying because he missed Elvis. He was crying because of what he helped Elvis hide. Now, you need to understand something about the position this man held. He wasn't a musician, so he had no creative ego competing with Elvis. He wasn't a manager, so he had no financial stake in controlling the narrative. He wasn't family, so he carried none of the complicated loyalty that silences relatives. He was something far more intimate than any of those roles, and that's precisely why what he knows matters so much. A tailor sees things nobody else sees. Think about it for a moment. A tailor measures your body when you're standing in your underwear, vulnerable and exposed. A tailor notices when you've gained weight before your own mother does. A tailor adjusts waistbands and lets out seams and takes in shoulders, and all of it happens in silence, in private rooms, away from the cameras and the handlers and the crowds screaming your name. Elvis Presley trusted very few people in this world. The Memphis Mafia surrounded him constantly, but even they were kept at arm's length when it came to certain vulnerabilities. The Colonel controlled his career with an iron fist, but there were rooms even Colonel Tom Parker didn't enter. Priscilla shared his bed, but there were truths he kept even from her. The tailor was different. When Elvis needed a fitting, he dismissed everyone. The bodyguards waited outside, the assistants disappeared, even the girlfriends were sent away. And in that private space, standing before mirrors that would eventually be removed because Elvis couldn't bear to see his own reflection anymore, the tailor would work in silence while the king of rock and roll let his guard down completely. Graceland's private fitting room became something like a confessional. Not intentionally, not formally, but organically, the way intimacy develops between two people who share space during vulnerable moments. Elvis would talk while being measured. He would ramble while adjustments were made. He would confess things between pin placements that he'd never say into a microphone or admit to the press. And the tailor listened. For nearly 2 decades, he listened. He watched Elvis transform from that electric young man who laughed while being fitted for Gold Lamb into something else entirely. He adjusted costumes as the body inside them changed, as the medication took hold, as the isolation deepened, as the spark behind those famous eyes began to dim. He witnessed the late-night emergency alterations before shows, the frantic calls to make something fit that hadn't fit the week before. He heard the excuses, the jokes that weren't really jokes, the deflections that fooled everyone except the man holding the measuring tape. But here's what shattered this 88-year-old man when he finally decided to speak. It wasn't the weight gain. It wasn't the addiction. It wasn't even the slow-motion tragedy of watching a legend crumble. Those stories have been told 1,000 times by 100 different people. No. The secret that left him in tears, the confession that kept him silent for 6 decades, involves what Elvis asked him to hide inside the lining of his final costumes. Something so unexpected, so heartbreaking, that this old tailor genuinely believed he was protecting Elvis by keeping it buried. Now he realizes he wasn't protecting Elvis at all. He was protecting something else entirely. And he refuses to die with it still hidden in the seams. The first time he measured Elvis Presley, it was 1961, and the world hadn't yet learned how to properly worship him. The tailor remembers every detail of that initial meeting with the kind of clarity that only significant moments carry through decades. Elvis walked into that fitting room like he owned not just the space, but the very air inside it. 26 years old, impossibly handsome, radiating a confidence that felt almost supernatural. When the tailor wrapped the measuring tape around that famous chest, Elvis cracked jokes the entire time. He laughed freely, moved easily, existed in his body like it was a gift he genuinely appreciated. That fitting was for the gold lamb suit, the one that would become iconic, the one that photographers would capture from every angle as Elvis revolutionized what it meant to perform. And the tailor remembers thinking, as he pinned fabric against that young, vital frame, that he was touching history, that this man would matter forever. He was right about that. He just didn't understand how much it would cost to be close to someone who mattered that much. 16 years later, in 1977, the tailor measured Elvis for what would become the final time. The contrast still haunts him. Same fitting room, same measuring tape, same man, technically, but nothing else was the same. Elvis had become something almost unrecognizable, not just physically but spiritually. The body the tailor measured that day told a story of systematic destruction, of medication and isolation, and a loneliness so profound it had become architectural, built into the very flesh. Elvis didn't crack jokes during that last fitting. He barely spoke at all. The silence between them stretched into something unbearable, punctuated only by the tailor's quiet requests to lift an arm or turn slightly. And in that silence, the tailor understood that he was no longer measuring a man. He was measuring what remained of one. But here's what the public never knew, what no biography has ever captured, what this tailor carried alone for nearly half a century. He was one of the only people who ever saw Elvis Presley cry. Not the performative emotion of a ballad, not the theatrical tears of a movie scene. Real tears. The kind that come from somewhere so deep they surprise even the person shedding them. It happened during a fitting in 1975, 2 years before the end. Elvis was standing there, arms outstretched while the tailor adjusted a jumpsuit when something simply broke inside him. Without warning, without build-up, Elvis began to weep. His whole body shook with it. And through those tears, he started talking about his mother. Gladys Presley had been dead for nearly 2 decades by then, but Elvis spoke about her like the loss was fresh, like he'd just received the phone call. He talked about how he'd failed her, how everything she'd feared for him had come true, how she'd warned him about the people who would surround him, take from him, use him until there was nothing left. And now look at him. Look at what he'd become. Something she would have been ashamed of. Something that proved every worried prayer she'd ever whispered had been justified. The tailor didn't know what to do. He wasn't a therapist. He wasn't family. He was just a man with pins in his mouth and fabric in his hands. So he did the only thing he could think of. He kept working. He let Elvis talk. He became a witness to grief that had nowhere else to go. And that's when everything changed. That's when Elvis stopped seeing him as just a tailor and started seeing him as something else. A safe place. A person with no agenda, no contract, no percentage of anything. Just a man with a tape measure and thread who knew how to keep his mouth shut. Which is why, in late 1976, Elvis asked him to do something he'd never done before. He asked him to sew something into his costumes. Not decorative, not visible. Hidden, functional in a way the tailor didn't understand at first. But when he finally did understand, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Because he realized he wasn't helping Elvis anymore. He was helping him disappear. Everyone assumed it was drugs. When the tailor first revealed that Elvis asked him to create hidden compartments in those famous jumpsuits, the immediate assumption was obvious. Pills, medications. The substances that everyone knew were slowly killing the king, but nobody had the courage to stop. It would make perfect sense. Hidden pockets sewn into the lining, accessible only to Elvis, invisible to anyone watching from the audience or standing backstage. A secret pharmacy pressed against his skin while he performed. But that's not what Elvis was hiding. The truth was something far more unexpected, far more human, and ultimately far more devastating than any handful of pills could ever be. Elvis was hiding letters, not letters he'd received, letters he'd written. Dozens of them over those final years, folded carefully and tucked into compartments the tailor created along the inner lining of costume after costume. Elvis wore his confessions against his body because he couldn't bring himself to speak them aloud. He carried words meant for people he loved but couldn't face, apologies he owed but couldn't deliver, truths he needed to express but couldn't force past his own lips. There were letters to Priscilla, trying to explain things he'd never been able to articulate during their marriage or after. Letters to Lisa Marie, written to a future version of his daughter, a teenager, an adult, a woman he sensed he might never live to see her become. Letters to his mother's grave, continuing conversations he'd been having with Gladys in his mind since the day she died. And most haunting of all, letters to himself, to the young Elvis, to the man he used to be, to whoever might find these words and finally understand what it felt like to be trapped inside a legend. The tailor knew about the compartments because he created them, but he didn't know about the contents until one afternoon when Elvis left a fitting in a hurry and something fell from the costume draped over the chair. A single piece of paper, folded into quarters, covered in that familiar handwriting. He should have set it aside without looking. He should have pretended he never saw it. But curiosity is a powerful thing, especially when you've spent years watching someone you care about disappear right in front of you. So he read it. The tailor won't quote the letter directly. He says those exact words belong to Elvis and Elvis alone. But he described the content in a way that makes your chest tighten just hearing it. Elvis was apologizing to his future self for what he was becoming. He was begging forgiveness from someone he hadn't failed yet but knew he would. He was writing from inside a prison of fame and medication and loneliness, leaving messages for anyone who might eventually find them and understand that he knew. He knew what was happening. He just couldn't stop it. And the tailor did nothing. That's the guilt that has eaten him alive for 47 years. He read that letter, understood that Elvis was screaming for help in the only way he could, and he sewed the pocket shut anyway. He created more compartments when Elvis asked. He watched the letters accumulate and never told a single soul who might have intervened. The costume Elvis died in, that final jumpsuit, contained a hidden pocket fuller than any other. The tailor found it after Elvis's death, when the garment was returned to him for preservation. Nobody else thought to check the lining. Nobody else knew to look. But he did, and he made a decision that still wakes him in the middle of the night, gasping with regret. He burned them. Every last letter from that final costume. He struck a match and watched Elvis's words turn to ash because he understood what those pages contained. They weren't just confessions, they were accusations. The people Elvis wrote about, the ones still alive then, still profiting from his name, still controlling his legacy, would have been destroyed if those words ever surfaced. And this tailor, this quiet man with steady hands and 60 years of silence, was too afraid to be the one holding the match to their reputations. So he burned the evidence instead. So why now? Why break 60 years of silence at 88 years old, when the secret has been safely buried for so long that almost everyone who would care is already gone? The answer is simple and devastating in equal measure. The tailor is dying. Prostate cancer, diagnosed 8 months ago, spread too far for treatment to matter. The doctors gave him 6 months, and he's already borrowed time beyond that. He doesn't want forgiveness. He made that clear from the moment he agreed to speak. Forgiveness implies he believes what he did might be excusable under certain circumstances, and he doesn't believe that at all. What he wants is simpler and more painful. He wants the truth to exist outside of himself before he stops existing entirely. He wants someone else to carry it forward so that when he's gone, the secret doesn't die with him and become meaningless. For 47 years, the weight of what he knew pressed against his chest every single morning. He thought about Elvis constantly, not the icon but the man, the one who stood in that fitting room with tears streaming down his face talking about his mother, the one who wrote letters he couldn't send and wore them against his skin like armor made of words, the one who trusted a tailor with his most vulnerable moments because there was nobody else safe enough to trust. And what did the tailor do with that trust? He watched, he sewed, he stayed silent, and when the moment came to speak up, to hand those letters to someone who might have helped, he struck a match instead. The people who surrounded Elvis in those final years, the Memphis Mafia members who wrote books about their loyalty, Colonel Tom Parker who controlled every aspect of his career, the doctors who kept prescribing medications they knew were killing him, they all had their reasons for staying. Silent, money, access, fear. The tailor understands those reasons because he shared them. in his own smaller way. He was afraid of what would happen if he spoke, afraid of losing his connection to that world, afraid of being the one who shattered the carefully constructed image that so many powerful people had invested in maintaining. But fear, he now understands, is not the same as innocence. Silence in the presence of someone's destruction is its own form of participation. He could have saved Elvis, maybe not through the letters themselves, but through what he saw in them. Elvis was screaming for help in thread and paper and hidden pockets, and everyone who could hear chose not to listen, including him. The tailor kept one item from all those years. Just one. A small piece of fabric cut from the lining of Elvis's final jumpsuit, from the area right beside where that hidden pocket sat full of undelivered words. It's nothing much to look at, just a swatch of white material slightly yellowed with age. But he's held it every single day for nearly 5 decades. It sits on his bedside table at night. It travels in his pocket during the day. It's the closest thing he has to a physical manifestation of his guilt. When he holds that fabric now, his hands shake the same way they did the first time he sewed a hidden compartment into one of those costumes. The same way they shook when he read that fallen letter. The same way they shook when he lit the match that turned Elvis's final words to ash. Before Lisa Marie passed away, the tailor recorded a message for her that he hoped someone might eventually deliver. He recorded messages for her daughters too, for Riley and the grandchildren who carry Elvis's blood without ever having known him. The messages all say essentially the same thing. The tailor's voice breaks as he continues, each word carrying the weight of decades of regret. Your father loved you in ways he couldn't speak, he says, his weathered hands clutching the worn fabric as if it might dissolve into memory at any moment. He wrote it down because the words wouldn't come any other way. For Elvis Presley, a man who could command stadiums full of screaming fans and seduce millions with his voice, the simple act of expressing love to his own child had proven impossibly difficult. The contradiction was tragic. He could bear his soul to the world through song, yet the most intimate emotions remained locked away, accessible only through the written word, penned in private moments away from the glare of fame's relentless spotlight. He wore those words against his heart every time he performed, the tailor continues, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, carrying you with him even when you couldn't be there. The image is both beautiful and heartbreaking. Elvis stepping onto stages around the world, the fabric containing his deepest feelings pressed close to his chest, a secret talisman of paternal love hidden beneath the rhinestones and embroidery that dazzled his audiences. The tailor's confession deepens, each admission more painful than the last. And I'm sorry I never gave them to you. I'm sorry I let fear make me a coward. I'm sorry I burned the only proof that existed of just how much you mattered to him. The destruction of those words, those irreplaceable expressions of a father's love, represents more than a single act of weakness. It symbolizes how fear can corrupt our better instincts, how a moment of panic can erase something precious that can never be recovered or recreated. His hands continue trembling as he holds that small remnant of fabric, all that survived his moment of terrible judgment. He hopes Elvis forgives him, the narrator observes, capturing the tailor's desperate wish for absolution from a man who can no longer grant it. But then, the tailor speaks again, and his words carry a devastating insight that changes the entire context of his confession. He doesn't think Elvis needed to forgive him. He thinks Elvis always knew he'd fail him. The statement hangs in the air like an indictment, not just of the tailor but of everyone who orbited Elvis's world. Everyone did, he adds simply, and in those 2 words lies a universe of collective failure. This final revelation shatters whatever emotional composure remains among those listening. It suggests that Elvis lived his life surrounded by people he knew would ultimately let him down, that he carried the burden of expecting disappointment from those closest to him. The tailor's failure wasn't unique or exceptional, it was simply one more instance in a pattern Elvis had come to accept as inevitable. The tailor's confession reveals layers of tragedy that extend far beyond a single burned letter or destroyed piece of fabric. It speaks to the isolation that fame creates, the walls that separate even fathers from children, and the way that fear and weakness can cause us to destroy the very things that matter most. Some secrets, as this story demonstrates, carry more weight than the people who keep them, crushing them under burdens that can never truly be set down. This narrative illuminates the hidden corners of Elvis Presley's life, revealing the human struggles behind the legend. For those moved by these untold stories, for those who recognize that history's greatest figures carried private sorrows that shaped their public lives, there remain countless other revelations waiting to be discovered, truths that challenge and deepen our understanding of the icons who defined their eras.